Human remains found near Alberta residential school. And the AFN National Chief calls for Queen to apologize for past wrongs. This is the Railway North Report.
I'm in love with the system. Never going home. I'm in love.
So earlier this week, Saddle Lake Cree Nation examined possible Blue Quills residential school burial sites, and they claim that there are human remains found near that school, which is probably true. I'm not going to deny it. There's probably graves there. And they're most likely children. So they're working with new archival work to explain numerous discoveries of human remains that now believes are the unmarked graves of residential school students. And they claim that since 2004 there have been numerous discoveries of partial remains that were accidentally excavated while new graves were being dug in the community cemetery, which is near the former Blue Quills residential school site. There probably is. There are many unmarked graveyards, especially in our history. I know in my hometown there is a cemetery where they knew it was there but didn't know the extent, and when they built some houses they came across graves that were outside the original bounds. So that's nothing uncommon, especially with the earliest pioneer cemeteries, which fell into disuse and were unknown for many years. So community members who discovered the remains were at that time unsure about what they found and reburied them. A team tasked with investigating burial sites connected to the school now believes it's been uncovering the shallow, unmarked graves of children between the ages of 4 and 10 who perished at the school. Well, if you guys discovered this in 2004 and didn't say anything, then it's also on you guys too. Why are you bringing this up now? Should have sounded the horn back in 2004, unsure about what they found. There were children-sized skeleton remains that were excavated. None of these skeletons' remains were in caskets. Well, if it's 100 years old, back then, caskets were not made of the best wood and probably deteriorated. Unless you're an archaeologist digging this site and looking at the evidence, how are you going to know there's a casket there? So what they've been doing, they've been compiling witness statements from community members who had discovered bodies, spoke to people who had missing family members, and reviewed archival records about the school. This is something that shouldn't have been happening back in 2004 or even before that. Catholic Church records obtained by investigators show that 212 students died at the school between 1898 and 1931, which for that time period does make sense. It's not right, but the federal records accounted for about 25 student deaths. Well, when did the federal records really keep track? Getting our record keeping back in those days was sketchy at best. Now, those 212 burial records are for the parish, not specifically for the residential school. And that the local bishop says that neither registers nor burial records for the school have been found. They probably didn't keep track that well. Look at that, 1898. That's when the West was really being opened up in 1931, the start of the Great Depression. So don't expect records to be well kept. Who knows how many people died during the Great Depression. So again, this news article makes it sensationalized. Like, we know there's probably bodies there. The question is, why haven't they dug them up? If they've known since 2004 that there are a lot of unmarked graves, start digging them up and doing the archaeology. I don't understand that. So in 2004, the community discovered what it believes to be a mass grave. Well, 2004, that's 18 years ago. And why has nothing been done since? Wrapped in white cloth, this could possibly be from when there was an outbreak of typhoid fever in the school. That makes total sense. Typhoid fever killed a lot of people, as did the Spanish influenza, anything else. So it's amazing how they're still holding this club over our head for something they knew back in 2004. And they haven't done anything. Now, I would rather get this over with and move on, because it did happen. It's a terrible tragedy, but I don't want a club over my head every year over this. For something I myself had nothing to do with. So his name is Whiskey Jack, said the last time he hit an unmarked grave while excavating a new one was in December. I don't recall because I always blocked that out of my mind to try to find a way to block it out of my mind. I mean, you hit an unmarked grave and you didn't immediately stop what you were doing and call in a team to investigate, to do the archaeology, to find out what it is, go through all the records. Come on. And this is when, back in Kamloops, where they used ground-penetrating radar to detect more than 200 potentially buried sites on the grounds. Potential. Well, it's now 1 year later and they still haven't dug up that site. They still haven't done the work to figure it out. And since then, a number of indigenous communities across the country have undertaken their own investigations and have made their own tragic discoveries for something they already knew. In many cases, the communities have chosen not to exhume the sites. Why? So they've used federal funding to pay for 2 pieces of ground-penetrating radar so that its own surveyors can conduct the search. It also requested funds from mental health services to support witnesses as more people are encouraged to come forward. All right, I can do that. I don't mind that. Better than giving $7 million to the Chinese Communist Party as part of foreign aid. So they say they believe there are even more children missing than the 212 who have been accounted for in the church records. It also said in the past many families were afraid or unable to speak out when a child never returned home. Again, let's dig up these graves. Let's go through the archives, find out what's supposed to be there. And then go through the grave sites, dig them up, give these children a proper burial, if it is children, find out how they died, when they died, because they're talking 33 years. Let's put it in context of the years. 1898. Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Liberal Prime Minister, was in power, and he took the vote away from the from First Nations people, which I think is, looking back upon it, it's a mistake, obviously. Why would you do something stupid like that? I personally think the whole reservation system was a mistake. Should never have happened. But it did. But at the time, it made perfect sense. The residential school system, for some, made perfect sense to solve a problem. Except for it failed in its original mission, depending how you look at it. It should have educated the indigenous children into becoming more, bringing them up into the modern world. I think it's a failure of both the First Nations people and the Canadian government. The fact that the residential school system was a failure and a mess reflects on both parties. This is nothing new though for the time period. Remember, back in 1898, orphanages and workhouses were common, poor houses. If you couldn't support yourself, you went to a poor house. The elderly did, where they're poorly fed, poorly housed, separate. Husbands and wives were separated from each other. And it was brutal. Poor houses were not fun places to be in. That was what the time period was like. Orphanages were not fun places to be in. And basically the residential school system acted as an orphanage, in my opinion. Barnardo's is probably the most common orphanage program out there. More than 100,000 British children were sent to Canada by Dr. Barnardo, a practice that lasted for decades and later drew controversy and finally an apology. So we don't talk about that anymore. 1869 and the late 1930s, more than 100,000 children were sent to Canada from Great Britain. Some were orphans, some were poor, many came from families who saw no other option. Overcrowding, disease, and homelessness rampant in England. The idea was to send children to the expansive land of Canada where they could help on farms and have a chance at a good life. Well, farmers paid a fee and the children were worked as indentured servants, which is another form of slavery, until they came of age. Some were treated well and taken in as members of family. Many were seen as little workers, and others were abused. The children were supposed to go to school, but this is often dependent on the farmer's needs and harvest season. There were dozens of such organizations at the time, but Barnardo's was the biggest. And that program didn't end until 1939. And who knows how many of these kids died. No one ever goes back and say, oh, these kids died too, from the Barnardo program. It's already been apologized. No one talks about it anymore. But it's a fact of life. So Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald calls for the Queen to apologize for past wrongs. Just because the Queen happens to be our constitutional head and also the titular head of the Anglican Church. Apologize for the Crown's ongoing failure to fulfill its treaty agreements with Indigenous peoples and such. There should be some restitution for harms perpetrated by the Canadian government in her name. Oh my God, we've already done so much. First of all, she's the titular head of the church, and the church already apologized in 1993. It also paid significant damage to survivors. So what's the problem now? The church already apologized. She's the titular head of the church. The church already apologized in her name. She's not likely to apologize simply because it's not something monarchs do. Because she does not hold any official position. with the Anglican Church. She just happens to be the head of it. It's one of those anomalies from way back. In fact, it's the Governor General as is our sovereign's representative. People tend to forget that. And they take the lead on all royal matters, which is right. Prime Minister Harper apologized for residential school abuses in 2008, initiated the compensation program that paid out more than $3.2 billion to survivors. I was okay with that money being spent. Meanwhile, a former AFN chief, Perry Bellegarde, told CBC that an apology from the Queen should not be a top priority. And he's quite right. It's over. We've apologized. We've spread equal apology from all Canadians. We have an Orange Day now. Indigenous activists should be focusing their energies on lobbying the government to tackle social issues like inadequate housing, boil water advisors, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prisons and foster care. I quite agree with that. Time to look forward instead of looking backwards. I find that the whole thing of reconciliation, which started way back, I think Indigenous leaders are keeping it as a club over our heads, kind of like how a lot of Black Americans keep the slavery thing as a club over the American heads. Our Indigenous leaders are keeping it over our heads to get more out of us, when in fact it's time to act, do what's right, and move forward. No system of government is perfect in this world. People make mistakes. This was a big mistake. And I feel bad for all the little kids who died in these schools. But at the same time, they're not alone. When you look back at that time period, you got to remember that things like typhoid, dysentery, cholera, smallpox were still killing people. We went through World War I. We went through the Spanish influenza. We went through the Great Depression, World War II. It was a pretty tumultuous time period. Canada was still forming in 1898. The West was still pretty much unsettled in many areas. Prior to 1898, we had the Northwest Rebellion, which that experience helped form the residential school policy. The idea that something needed to be done. So I'd like to see our Indigenous leaders start moving forward, because what's going to happen? Like when the last survivors of these residential schools are dead, then what are they going to use? Anyway, any Canadians, let me know what you guys think. Should we dig up the graves and find out what happened, and then decide from there? Or should we continue to apologize and throw millions of dollars instead of fixing the real problems? Let me know in the comment section. Hit the like button, subscribe if you're new to the channel. Until next time, this has been the Great White North Report.
I'm in love with